After a wildly successful debut season, Lawnie McLawnface and his men stared at a daunting and exciting new prospect: League football. The champions of a conference were promoted to the English 3rd Division, and that was where the big boys played. It had been some time since Lawnie had had a look at his squad, but they seemed to be doing fine with opening wins against Colchester and Shrewsbury as he dipped his toe in the water. But there was no doubt that he'd lost a number of key players in the previous season in order to balance the books, with Graham Harby leaving voluntarily on a Bosman, the least painful of these, compared to his key midfield losses in John Constable joining Watford and Darren Bastow now a Baggy, and first-team defenders Tom Culshaw and Jason Lanns joining the boroughs, Peterborough and Middlesbrough respectively. Lawnie was cautious with the new money, spending just over 100,000 of it signing Kyle May from Carlisle to play in central defence, and utility defender Michael Davenport from Oldham to cover gaps. Jamie Davis from Rushden and Steve Maden from Bury soon joined. Davis was still developing as a player and needed to cut his teeth in the reserves, but Maden was a shoo-in due to the midfield crisis. The other notable signing was Joey Dunn as player-coach at the end of the season, only for him to immediately retire to just coach. The rest of the spending was on wages and sign-on bonuses for a series of talented free agents to fill out the ranks, aside from inexplicably overpaying for Craig Edwards from Grays Athletic, who must have had damning blackmail information on McLawnface or his board of directors, who eagerly facilitated the transfer. McLawnface was extremely high on youngster David Nichols, who he played in rotation with player-coach Andy Porter, and broke the club's record for youngest player at just 16 years of age. Were Porter's days as a starter numbered in the wake of his exceptional new talent? The manager's trademark mix of investing in youth while also keeping experienced players around meant it could go either way for the Chester original, one of only 2 players left who were playing for the club on the day that McLawnface joined. Stuart Rimmer was technically a player, having decided not to retire. His presence in the locker room was useful for the youngsters, but he was unlikely to see any game time. After refamiliarising himself with the rest of the names, the manager selected a starting 11 to play against Northampton in the first round of the League Cup. Winning ways continued with Moran netting twice, but new midfielder Maden not covering himself in glory by getting sent off in the 76th minute. Chester held on to win 2-1. There was no doubt now, the players were having to try much harder to win these games, and their condition was deteriorating faster than before. This was where Lawnie's planning came into play. By signing so many useful young players, he had a fit and ready replacement for every position without breaking the wage structure of the club. Every few matches he would retool the starting lineup based on fitness, and it paid dividends, with wins against Southend and Hartlepool. But there was another issue. John Carroll was playing well, but despite the wins and the performance ratings, his goal tally sat at 0. Could he really hack it at this higher level, or were his feelings being exposed by the level of play? Lincoln City awaited, and within 6 minutes the striker put those rumours to bed, leading the team to a 3-0 romp. Though it wasn't lost on the youngster that Steve Moran was scoring many more goals than he was, and teenage sensation David Nichols was getting all the plaudits, winning the English 3rd Division Young Player of the Month award and happily standing beside Manager of the Month Lawnie McLawnface at the ceremony. To compound his woes, a very talented young striker called Barry Sr. was starting to make waves in the reserves. In no time at all, he had snatched the substitution spot from fellow reserve Ian Evans and found himself promoted to the senior squad in the process. Former Norwich player Darren Kenton agreed to provide cover for the defence on a free transfer, and he was joined by another teenage defender in Nicky Teaney. These defensive signings meant that McLawnface had a wealth of talent to pick from in the demanding fullback area, on both the right and left hand side of the pitch, and his constant recycling of players in order to keep them fresh was paying dividends. With 2 goals to the good against Bristol Rovers, he brought on Senior for Carroll, and on the 62nd minute the youth struck, scoring on his debut and equalling the goal tally of a player he had replaced. After hitting the post and the side netting, the hungry striker netted a second goal in the 90th minute. This left McLawnface in a quandary. Would he start the red-hot striker against Macclesfield, or would he stick with his top scorer from last season? He stuck with his guns, but Macclesfield took the lead. Lawnie needed goals from his side, and fast. He decided to bring on Senior, and Moran scored. Again. With the last seconds of the game ticking away, cometh the moment, cometh the man, cometh the goal. From defender Simon Anderson, his first for the club, snatching 3 points at the death. In the complicated matrix of Lawnie's attack, Mr. Anderson had been the chosen one. Carroll was preferred to the newcomer and repaid his manager with a goal against Cheltenham, but McLawnface continued substituting Senior on. He saw something in the young striker, and looked at him the same way that he had with Carroll the season before. Meanwhile, having lost his place to Nichols, Andy Porter was facing an altogether different problem. Injuries had kept him out of the side, and he wasn't getting any younger. After recovering from one injury, he was beset with another, breaking his nose in training. The problems were starting to mount up, and he played no part in the League Cup fixture against Millwall. Chester were put to the sword in the first 10 minutes with 2 goals against them, and all hope looked lost, but a hideous foul from Brown in the box led to a straight red card and a penalty. Moran continued scoring. Higgins made it 2-2 against 10-men Millwall, and at half-time McLawnface brought Barry Senior on. 90 minutes played, all on the line, and finally, Moran continued scoring, taking the team to the next round of the competition. But notably, the assist for the goal was by Senior. 2 goals and an assist in 3 substitution appearances was a strong start, much stronger than starting striker John Carroll, and a nice headache for the manager to have. Once again, Lawnie started Carroll against Rochdale, and the striker repaid him, scoring twice and fighting for his place in the squad. Porter suffered yet another injury with a groin strain, and Chris Palmer picked up an injury in a lacklustre draw against Hull. Both were out for the rest of the month, and the injuries and suspensions kept mounting, causing Lawnie to keep shuffling. He made 3 substitutions against Scunthorpe, only to have Kevin Norman pick up an injury mid-game. Since he'd used all his subs, he was down to 10 men for the last 10 minutes. But suspect signing Craig Edwards scored his first goal for the club to get all 3 points in a nervy affair. They destroyed Plymouth, but injuries continued to haunt them. This time it was first-team defender Kyle May who went down early against Northampton, and they could only manage a goalless draw. Another player out for a month. With Nichols not fit and the reserve defensive midfielders also injured, McLawnface realised that he could have really used Andy Porter for the next fixture, but the 34-year-old remained on the physio's table, willing to play but not match fit. A 3-1 victory was tighter than the scoreline suggested, but Vance Warner hobbled off against Rushton towards the end of the game, leaving Lawnie McLawnface without a first-team defensive midfielder who was fit. Blackpool made a move for top-scoring midfielder Moran, but it was rejected outright, and thus the sniffing from bigger clubs began. Fortunately, Nichols had recovered in time for the Darlington game, so there was at least one recognised defensive midfielder who could play. The injuries kept piling up, with only reserve defender Jim Williams available on the left, and Lawnie falling back to his conference defensive pairing of Scott and Ryan to fill the centre-half roles. His keeping hold of squad players was again a good move. A win against Bury was enough to convince Millwall to pick up John Rankin for £250,000, and pundits started to predict a season of glory for Chester, who were riding high in first place. Unfortunately, their next stop in the League Cup was against Premier League Fulham, so their cup ambitions were at an end. An early goal from Carroll, followed by a penalty from Moran, gave them a shock 2-0 lead, and they desperately held on for the rest of the half. Andy Porter rewarded his selection with a third, and suddenly Chester were uncatchable, so Lawnie decided to attack more, with Andrew Gordon grabbing a 4th as Fulham fell to pieces. A 5th from Super Sub Senior resulted in the most unlikely win of the season so far. Chester City 5, Fulham 0. York City handed them defeat in the league, with Moran getting sent off in the process, and a furious Lawnie changed the starting 11 some more, resulting in poor Oldham being destroyed 5-0. Peterborough matched Martin Garratt's release clause, meaning that McLawnface had no choice but to accept a bid of 300,000. Garratt left a parting shot at the manager. Apparently he had never enjoyed playing under him. This overshadowed the convincing 2-0 victory over Division 2 side Notts County, which advanced them even further into the League Cup. Exhausted from fixture congestion, Lawnie fielded his reserve squad against conference side Lee RMI, and the fresh legs paid off with a 5-0 win and a hat-trick for Barry Sr., who was really pushing for a first-team start. Wolves offered $500,000 for Alex Higgins, which was more than enough for the fiscally prudent manager to accept, as he still had plenty of midfielders. A mere $8,000 was spent on Brighton's Stephen Melton for cover, with double that for Swansea's Gareth Phillips. A bizarre incident against Carlisle stemmed from a bad tackle from May, resulting in a red card in the last minute of the game. McLawnface dropped striker Carroll back into the unfamiliar position of midfield, only for him to start a fight and also get sent off. 9-man Chester held out for the win. A draw against Luton followed, but was quickly forgotten about when West Ham United made a ridiculous bid of £1 million for top scorer Steve Moran, an offer that was simply too good to refuse. After 2 seasons and 83 games, he was off to the Premier League. There was no replacing him, but to provide cover, Lawnie snapped up 30-year-old free agent David Pritchard, who could also play in defence. Moran had one last game for the club before the transfer was complete, the League Cup quarter-final against Premier League Sunderland. An early goal from Nicky Teaney put Chester improbably ahead, and Steve Maden doubled it in the second half. Somehow they'd made it through to the next round. Speaking of rounds, the second round of the FA Cup saw them through with a 1-0 victory against Peterborough, with youth midfielder Jamie Davis blossoming in the absence of Moran with the winning goal. The third cup competition fixture in a row was against Carlisle, where a dogged display from an exhausted Chester led them to a win on penalties after 120 minutes of play. Unsurprisingly, this led to a tight win against Shrewsbury before Southend took advantage of the tired legs and beat Chester 2-0 in the league. They were scraping by with reserve players filling gaps, but the results kept coming. McLawnface picked up Adam Jewell on loan from Leyton Orient to bolster their attacking midfield options, and purchased Blackpool's Steve McMahon for £12,000 to finally fill the gap Moran's presence had caused in the middle of the park. The midfield maestro immediately rewarded him with an injury-time goal against Norwich, putting them through to the next round of the FA Cup. A draw against 17th placed Lincoln didn't help matters, but the 2-1 victory against Notts County kept their Vans Trophy ambitions alive. Tranmere Rovers, seeing the previous transfer dealings, came for Lawnie's best defender Vance Warner and put another cool $1 million on the table. Seeing as how Chester weren't lacking in central defence, he knew he had to accept the offer. He'd now made £3 million since November, and Chester's financial straits had gone from dire to comfortable for the first time, with $5 million in the bank. A Carroll goal was just enough to see off Halifax, but the fourth round of the FA Cup beckoned, and this time there would be no miracle for the strained squad. Chester put up a valiant effort against Premier League Leeds, but lost 1-0. So when the semi-final first leg of the League Cup came against Crystal Palace, 2-1. In the league, they just needed to keep pace with Hull's form, and a draw with Macclesfield and a win against Chesterfield was acceptable for now. It was a nervy evening in Selhurst Park as Chester came to London with a goal in hand, which was immediately wiped out by Clinton Morrison within 2 minutes. Defender May levelled proceedings before the end of the half, but Green made it 2-1 Palace. Penalties beckoned if it stayed like this. In the 81st minute, Steve McMahon netted, and all Chester had to do was hold on to win 4-3 on aggregate, which they did, taking them to the League Cup final. A bizarre incident occurred in the 40th minute of the next game against Scunthorpe, when goalkeeper Wayne Brown went down with an injury, forcing standby Damian Williamson to play his first game of the season. He kept a clean sheet and Chester went on to win 2-0, and Williamson himself got an extended run of games in the squad. League rivals Hull City were put in their place in the semi-final of the Vans Trophy, and then Chester discovered their opponents for the League Cup final, Arsenal. Oh well, it was a good run. League rivals Hull City were spanked 4-1 to add insult to injury, and Barry Sr. secured his spot in the first team with yet another hat-trick, making it 12 goals with only 13 starts in his 28 appearances this season. Amakachi broke the deadlock early, but a second-half goal from Carroll and a stupid sending-off in the 88th minute for Crewe meant that Chester advanced to a final they actually could stand a chance of winning, thanks to a late penalty. Starlet Dave Nichols, who Lawnie had praised to the moon, had played left-back, right-back, centre-back and defensive midfield for the club over the course of the season, and his £200,000 release clause was activated by Bournemouth, and Lawnie had no choice but to accept. Another first-team player destined to leave, and one that Chester couldn't afford to lose so late in their season. Much like Moran though, he had one more game to play. The final against the mighty Arsenal. Funny thing about top British teams, they end up playing their second or third string in lesser cup competitions, and with such luminaries as Graham Barrett, Jermaine Brown, John Spicer and Joe Osai Kufur, it was Chester City 2, Arsenal 0. The impossible happened, and thanks to Arsene Wenger's horrific team selection and an early second half red card, his 10-man Arsenal reserves were beaten, and it was Nichols who scored one of the winning goals. A fine swan song for... Wait, what? He rejected Bournemouth's contract and decided to stay on until the end of the season. With Nichols remaining in the squad and Barry Sr. winning Player of the Month, Chester took apart York. Now they visited Brunton Park to face Carlisle, knowing that thanks to Hull's recent high-profile slip-ups, a point was all they needed to win the league title outright and make it mathematically impossible for any other team to catch them. 54 minutes played, Carlisle 2, Chester 0. Celebrations would have to wait, but a furious Lawnie McLawnface was bellowing at his players from a touchline, demanding they give everything they had left. Maden made it 2-1, and Barry Sr. tucked away an 86th minute goal to level it. The final whistle blew, and Chester had won back-to-back promotions. Then something very strange happened. Manchester United placed a bid for one of Lawnie's players, but it wasn't Nichols or one of his other first-team stars. Instead, it was for second-string defensive midfielder Robert McNab. They were willing to give him $250,000 for the pleasure. Okay then, a few more perfunctory league fixtures were played out, and then Chester headed to Cardiff for the final of the Vans Trophy against Swansea. 90 minutes came and went, and no goals appeared, and looking at the condition of his players it was clear that some couldn't continue the pace. Then he had to make a choice. Stick with the exhausted striker Barry Sr. or bring on John Carroll. He couldn't show the players his indecision, and standing before them with a confidence he didn't feel, Lawnie McLawnface stated that he wanted Senior to continue. 6 minutes later, Senior struck the golden goal in extra time, winning the Vans Trophy. The young striker had gone from being clubless, into the reserves, out to the subs bench, into rotation, and then finally to making the forward role his own. And now he had a domestic treble to show for it. It was party time against Torquay, with Chester 3 to the good. Adam Jewell and Danny Williams finished their loans, but Lawnie put in a cheeky bid for Jewell, telling the papers he was making the offer because Jewell had proven to be an excellent acquisition, and the loanee became a permanent signing for the season to come. A draw with Kidderminster brought the season to a close, and Premier League Tottenham snapped up Nichols after interest from several high-profile teams. Hull and Luton rightfully also won promotion, but there was no denying Chester, who finished 26 points clear with just 3 losses, thanks to an outstanding defence, conceding only 17 goals all season. It was a fitting end to Lawnie McLawnface's improbable second season. His investment in youth Wheeler dealing in the transfer windows that would put Harry Redknapp to shame, and constant squad rotation meant his players were fitter for longer, and the sound tactics and victories meant few of them were unhappy. But this was the lowest tier in the league, and there was no chance of a domestic treble next season. He'd be hard pressed in the second division, and his eyes were ever turned to the future, even as the champagne flowed in the boardroom. He had lost many good players this season who he hadn't quite replaced. There was a lot of work to be done before the whistle blew for the next season and a new chapter in Chester City's history. But both he and the board knew now that Lawnie McLawnface was the man to do it.